Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Paige. I'm a master's candidate for Hawaiian language at UH Manoa under Uilani. I have a graduate research assistantship under the Institute of Hawaiian Language Research and Translation, funded by JIMAR, the Joint Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research. My advisor is Kumupua. He's right over there. So to give you folks a background of the JIMAR and the Institute's partnership, JIMAR provides funding for research in my position. At the end of the day, we are bridging language with science. This opportunity and this kind of research allows for cross-discipline academics. I'm touching a science field that I wouldn't actually ever have to deal with or know about if JIMAR didn't provide funding for this type of research. In our department, we don't do science research per se. There's no avenue for scientific research in our language department. So through my research, I'm basically providing data for scientists and creating pathways to develop high-level language skills for us as master's students and Hawaiian language speakers. So one of the big things that I manage is called the JIMAR database. It's a database that I've inherited from previous graduate research assistants. It's basically a big Google spreadsheet, but it's got over 4,000 articles identified and organized. I've got all the metadata in columns: date published, event, place, title, author, citation. There's also a URL on the database to access the digitized image of the original article. We have over 20 event categories along with their summaries. For us, they're categorized by events like ocean, wind, wave, quake, volcano, etc. Over 300 of these articles have been fully translated and then edited, formatted, and uploaded online at our website. So this is just an example, sort of quick snippet of what the database looks like. You can see the date published here in the corner, the general events, a more specific event description. So under the big umbrella of ocean, this particular article talks about turbulent seas, forceful, strong winds. It'll give you an island, so it's Maui, specifically Wailuku, a title, an author, if it's available on the article, the newspaper, full citation, and the URL link. So our current focus are eruptions, seismic events, and tsunami and wave events. So on this left side, you'll have the English, and then the right side, you'll have the Hawaiian search terms. And I did grab a couple example article titles. So oftentimes, if I'm looking for eruptions or something related to volcanic activity, it'll talk about the Luapele. Seismic events will have ʻOlaʻi in it. And then, of course, our tsunami and wave events will have something like Kaiho'e'e or Kaimimiki. So those are kind of the quick search terms that I use to go in the database and pull up these articles. Basically, the process that we have to go through starts off with article selection, so related to our topic, and then the translation. And then the biggest and most impactful part of the process is this healo a healo. That's when I sit with Kumupua and we go over and he edits. Something I think that's not often talked about or not well known is that we do not train translators in our department. It's not what we do. It's not a focus of our department, but it's something that we do in this position. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of wordsmithing. There's a lot of edits to be done. There's a lot of knowledge that Kumu has that I don't have, and I won't be able to get it until I sit with him and walk through these articles. And then at the end of it, once he approves it for accuracy, then it gets uploaded to our website, and then we update the database. So I have just a quick example article for you folks. This one was printed in the Keoko'a on April 16th, 1868, written by D. Holoua in Ninole Ka'u on Hawaii Island. So, and this is just the first paragraph of a really long article. It's probably about 10 inches long in this column format. And it talks about an eruption of Kilauea. And already in the first paragraph, and what I deal with a lot is the citizen science, but that in the first paragraph alone, it's packed with data. So already we have a date, a specific time, what they were doing, what was going on, what they saw, what they felt. And it's really specific. He can point out where he saw the smoke emerge, at what time it was, how long time had passed before, he could see the lava. And so these are the kinds of things that I touch and I deal with. And all of this data goes to providing not just scientists, but the public and our people with this window into a time. This is in 1868. So we're bringing back the knowledge that our kupuna had back to the front, back to the forefront. Another example looks like this one. It's actually about a tsunami, and it's called a strange tsunami. It's a kaiho'e ano'e. And it actually talks about this sort of strange tsunami occurrence in Waialua. And it talks about how the tsunami rose and it began above Waimea, flowed down, and all the way through to the river mouth of Kayaka and back up. So it's really a strange occurrence because now you know that our kupuna know what a tsunami was and they know it comes in from the ocean. So for them to relate this kind of activity coming down from a river and then wrapping around, and if they don't have, maybe today we have a really specific term for it, but this is what they related it to then, and that's why they're explaining that it's sort of a strange occurrence. They've never seen this before. So these are just really quick examples of pretty much what I deal with and what they look like. But for us, and for me personally and academic, the main thing is that this project, these funders provide us a graduate research opportunity. They're very few and far in between. They're competitive. And this job has Hawaiian language as a requirement. For us as Hawaiian language students and speakers, it's hard to find jobs that put our skills as a requirement, that are almost outside of a classroom. I get to deal with things that I would never touch ever. All of this ʻike of our kupuna that's sort of kept in this repository that unless you know where to look or you have the language skills, you don't get to touch on an everyday basis. The translation experience and the language skill building is really important for us to develop our skills as Hawaiian language speakers, future teachers, within this work field. And all of it ties into providing us with a historical language context. So today, English today is different from the English 200 years ago. So Hawaiian today that we learn in the classroom is also different from the Hawaiian that our kupuna spoke every day 200 years ago. And it's really important for us to be able to recognize the differences and contextualize that to what we do today. And then of course it provides us these outreach opportunities like tonight. But that's pretty much what I do. So mahalo nui. Coming up next is my friend Kilika, my coworker, classmate, all things. So mahalo.
Well, aloha mai kākou. So my name is Kilika Bennett, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'm also a graduate research assistant for the Institute of Hawaiian Language Research and Translation. And so for the next few moments, what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing with you folks a project that I worked on when I initially joined the Institute. And that was a project called Lani, Reconstructing Climate Patterns in Hawaii. For this project, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Rosie Allegado, who's an assistant professor in oceanography at UH. And the focus of this project was to research through the Hawaiian language repository to see what it could reveal about the past occurrences of El Nino events here in the islands. And so the reason that we wanted to consult the Hawaiian language newspapers is because we know that Kapo'e Kahiko were keen observers of their environment, not just Kapo'e Kahiko Hawaii or ancient peoples of Hawaii, but all around the world. For instance, the term El Nino comes from 17th century Chilean fishermen who were able to recognize that in years where the sea was a lot warmer than normal, it would yield less fish. Also, what is currently known as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation was initially identified by Northwestern Pacific fishers who were able to track salmon populations on 20-year cycles. So we knew that for Hawaiians, it would be similar. Hawaiians were keen observers of their environment, and they were able to identify cycles in nature. Survival here in the islands required them to understand the annual and seasonal cycles of growth and production here. And it also necessitated avenues for multi-generational transmission of this knowledge, the ability to pass it down from generation to generation. So through their oli and their mele, which are their songs and chants, through their olelo their proverbs, and through their mo'olelo and ka'au, their legends and their stories, and also through their mo'okahuna, which were their priest lines, they were able to pass this knowledge down orally. Luckily for us, literacy occurs in 1820, while this knowledge is still extant, it's still widespread. Even by 1840, I believe, it is believed that nearly 100% of Hawaii's population was literate, able to read and write in their own language. And so this literacy fosters the documentation of traditional Hawaiian language in the newspapers with in writing, in documents. With writing letters beginning in 1822 and the newspapers beginning in 1834. In addition to literacy, another factor that led to the documentation of Hawaiian knowledge in the newspapers was the fear that all of this knowledge would disappear because a lot of people were passing away. And so in this article written in Kalama, Hawaii, the writer urges the chiefs to document their knowledge in the newspapers so that the future generations will know that this knowledge was valuable and that they cared about the things of old. So this sort of shows you that the Hawaiian language newspapers were truly an intentional repository of knowledge. So just to give a better background or the more in-depth background of the Hawaiian language newspapers, they began in 1834 and ran through 1948. And within this time period, there are about 100 different Hawaiian language newspapers. In all, there are about 125,000 newspaper pages of text, which is equivalent to about 1.5 million letter-sized pages of text, making this repository the largest indigenous language repository in the world. Unfortunately, only about 3% is included in modern text and curriculum, and 97% remains largely unused and unknown. But fortunately for us today, a large portion of the repository has been digitized and made word searchable and can be accessed at papakilodatabase.com and upepa.org, which is the main search engines I utilize for my research. So when it came to trying to research through the Hawaiian language newspapers to find out what they could reveal about the past occurrences of El Nino events, we had to come up with a strategy. Because we cannot just type in El Nino into a Hawaiian language database and expect to pull up any results. And so what we decided to do was come up with lists of observable manifestations of El Nino events. So we know that in summers, Hawaii is usually, summers are usually our our drier and warmer seasons, and winters are our cooler and wetter seasons. So for summers, we would look for shifts in that norm. So wetter than normal summers, a lot of hurricanes and storms or even flooding, and perhaps even higher sea surface temperatures that result in chlor bleaching and fish kills, and then weaker trade winds. And in winters, we would look for drought, famine, and low stream flow. And so this is sort of the kahua, the foundation that we use to sort of our next phase. Whoop. There's actually a missing slide here. Okay, well, I'll just describe to you the process anyways. So basically what we would do is we'd take a specific indicator of the El Nino. So take hurricanes and storms, for instance. would translate that term into Hawaiian. So hurricanes and storms can be translated in Hawaiian as makani ino or makani pahili. And then what we'll do is we'll take that Hawaiian language search term and then type it into papakilodatabase.org, that search engine that I showed you folks before. And then I would pull all mentions of that search term from the repository. Once I pull all those search terms, I have to go through all of them. So just like searching through Google, you have to be as specific as normal, as possible. Otherwise, you're going to pull up every article and its mom, because one word in Hawaiian can have many different meanings. After I filter through the articles for literal mentions of a specific term, because there are sometimes articles that will use more metaphoric language, or sometimes there are just articles that aren't relevant. We'll just filter those out. And so the little observations are what we use to build a time series. And with that time series, we try to search for a sense of seasonality that might be tied to El Nino events. And so what we wanted to do first was start with a search term that we felt we would yield the most results for. And since Chilean fishermen found the El Nino cycle through observing fish behavior, we decided, why not observe fish behavior here in Hawaii? And Dr. Rosie actually remembered an omen that was tied to the Aveo and the Alalawa fish. And the omen says that the reddening of the sea was a sign of the impending death of an ʻEli, and that reddening was caused by an abundance of Alalawa or Aveo fish. And so we wanted to try and see if these sightings in the Hawaiian language newspapers were tied to El Nino events. Oh, here it is. That's the one that was missing. But when we pulled the articles of the Alalawa sightings from the repository, we were able to find about 325 articles. Many of them look like this. After we filtered for the literal mentions, we found that there are about only 145. And from these sorts of articles, we were able to extract a few tidbits of information. First, with prior knowledge, we knew that the Aveo and the Alalawa fish were fish that Hawaiians were familiar with. They had names for these fish. Also, this particular article mentions the fishing of this fish. But what's interesting from this article is the fish is actually introduced or referred to as an ia anomalihine, or as an infrequently seen fish. And so that sort of suggests to us that perhaps its runs are a little bit episodic. And so what we did was we created a time series graphing the amount of Alalawa and Aveo observations per year. And we'll see that after having normalized the information, that there are probably about an average of about 2 sightings per year of Alalawa fish. But then all of those outliers that you see, so these green arrows, all of those years are years where there is an abnormally large amount of Aveo and Alalawa sightings recorded in the Hawaiian language newspapers. And many of those mentions and those outliers correlate to years of suspected El Nino events. So in essence, what we've identified through this research is a new climate pattern. Perhaps for 17th century Chilean fishermen, El Nino seasons might have looked like less fish, but for Hawaii, it would have looked like an abundance of Alalawa and Aveo. So the value of this project comes in the fact that we get to extend the climate record back into the 19th century. All of these articles are quantified and made into usable data that can help to reconstruct Hawaii's natural history, and also we get to identify new climate patterns. One of the things I really love about these projects is the fact that we get to merge both contemporary and indigenous knowledge, because we get to understand a more holistic, or understand things more holistically. And I hope that it inspires more research in the Hawaiian language repository. And with that, I just want to leave you guys with my biggest mahalo. So up next, we have Uilani.
Aloha mai kākou. I'm Uilani Al. I am also a graduate student at ʻIkeWai Uilani Center for Hawaiian Language at UH Manoa. and I am also a graduate research assistant at the Institute of Hawaiian Language Research and Translation. The project that I work on is called ʻIkeWai, so it is a groundwater sustainability project, and the newest project that our institute is working on. Kilika actually is my co-researcher on this project now that his has completed. So I wanted to start a little bit by talking about our institute, even though my coworkers already kind of have, but like Paige mentioned, we're not a translation institute. What we do is provide access to Hawaiian language research and research materials that are in the Hawaiian language, so more or less inaccessible to those outside of our department. We believe that these resources are valuable for all fields of scholarship at the university, for government agencies and nonprofits, so our main goal is to provide access to those resources. And like they mentioned, it also provides training for us as future leaders of Hawaiian language. The project I work on is called ʻIkeWai. So UH Manoa has teamed up with NSF, which is National Science Foundation, and EPSCoR to address the grand challenge of water sustainability here in Hawaii. So this is a multidisciplinary team at UH that includes hydrology, microbiology, geology and geophysics, pretty much most of SOEST, and our department, our institute over in Hawaiian language. So the IHLRT and ʻIkeWai are teaming up to provide historical indigenous knowledge of our test sites, which are Kona on Hawaiʻi Island and Ewa here on Oahu, as well as any surrounding areas and all of the historical indigenous knowledge regarding our water resources and any stewardship we can find. Our main archive that we'd like to play in is the newspaper archive, which went from 1834 to 1948. There were 100 different newspapers that were published in that time. And like Kilika mentioned, over 125,000 pages. So it's a huge repository for us to try and pull information on. And when you have a topic as broad as water, you can really pull information from anything from news articles, obituaries, advertisements, our traditional stories and fables. So it's really, really rich repository for any research project. But when you're dealing with water, I think it's really important as well. Papakilo database is one of the main search. So for a particular project, we've divided our research methodology into two sections. The first is place-based research. So our two test sites are Kona and Ewa. So if we look at those two sites, we can kind of see what water, and there are any ponds and streams historically, so we can look for actual place names on Papakilo. We can also do term-based research, so we can kind of translate terminology from hydrology, geology, and geophysics and try and find a Hawaiian equivalent within the newspaper. For place-based research, we usually use maps kind of to guide us because the newspaper archive is historical. It's 1834 to 1948. A lot of the place names we use today or see on the maps today aren't the ones they were using at that time. So we rely on older maps like this one, which is a territory of Hawaii map from 1901. Alexander did this one. And it's kind of hard to tell on here, but it actually shows in detail a lot of the ahupua'a, a lot of the bodies of water that were present, any streams and ponds that were running at that time. So with these maps, we're able to pull old place names and search them on Papakilo and see what type of results, what type of information we can get about water from them. Another resource we use is Hawaii place names, which has been digitized and put on ulukau.org. We're able to go to the Hawaii Island section, go to the district of Kona, and look at all the different ahupua'a or smaller land boundaries that are in there. So ahupua'a are those little pie-sliced land boundaries, and they had to have water inside of them. So we can locate the different ahupua'a, we can pull the type of water bodies from there. The search area in Kona has approximately about 40 ahupua'a in that area that we're looking at. So we can kind of follow a traditional land boundary system in our research, going from Mokupuni, our island, to Moku, the district, and then Ahupua'a, which contains water. One of the examples I have up here is in Hawaii and Kona, there is the Ahupua'a of Pu'uva'awa'a. It's one of the northernmost Ahupua'a in Kona. And one of the famous bodies of water in there is ʻIkeWai. So these are two different articles that came up for that search. One is from Kanaiaupuni, in the story of Kamehameha I. They talk about his cousin Keoua bathes in ʻIkeWai before meeting Kamehameha and his imminent death. He goes and cleanses himself there, purifies himself. So we know from this article that ʻIkeWai was a famous swimming hole. This particular person swam in it, and it was deep enough at least for a person to bathe in. So we can get that type of information from this article. From this one, the Ho'onanea o Kumanava, or pleasurable pastimes, it goes over very specifics about the body of water. So it says it's a large pond nearing Kiholo and Laimano, and it was famed for being swam in by the chiefs of old. It goes into how the temperature is really cold, like ice water. So we're able to pull lots of information, little kind of science nuggets, as we call them, from these articles and hand them over to our researchers on the science end, see what they can do with this type of information. The other thing we do is actually take terms from hydrology and geology and all those, like submarine groundwater discharge, and try and find a Hawaiian equivalent. Like, how would have they been discussing that in these newspapers? So submarine groundwater discharge is when the groundwater table is so full it starts to kind of come out into the ocean. So we tried to find a phenomenon that would describe that. And in this, this is actually a dirge, or like a lamentation chant, written by a grandmother after losing her grandson. And she describes this particular body of water, Hali'ilua, as a fresh water mixing with the sleet water. So from this, we can kind of tell about the water table. Maybe it's brackish water, actually, and not fresh water at all. And we get a little bit information about the water composition. So some of the terms we've come up with is waihu or waihua'i for surging or upwelling water, and then this wai avilipu mekekai, the fresh water mixing with salt water. And those types of feature descriptions we're able to put into the database and see what it yields. For me, the value of the Hawaiian language newspaper archives is just how rich it is in data and content for all disciplinaries. So when I first started playing around in newspapers, I never would have thought how valuable it would be for scientists or for people doing these big research projects. But I really like to see, you know, our firsthand accounts from our ancestors, from these people of old that were written down and utilizing into modern science today. I think it's valuable and important. This is our ike kupuna, so our ancestral knowledge. It has our stories, it has our chants and our songs in it, and to see that there's actual science tidbits or information that can be pulled from those types of things is really important too. And like I think we all touched on, that bridge between the modern scientific research and our traditional knowledge systems is something I think we're all fighting for, even as non-scientists, non-science majors. It's been wonderful for us to see. With that, we will take any questions you have. Mahalo nui.
Do you have any questions? Yes.
One of the first slides showed fleetingly a picture of what appeared to be a very fuzzy camel.
Ah, yes.
Camelo.
I stole the name from Hawaii.
If I'm not mistaken, that's the first issue. No, the camel. And I think in the article, didn't we just run this in class? It's there because a camel was, at that time, it's 1861. There was a camel at the zoo.
1860.
Yeah, on display. So the ad was there to tell people to come and see this thing, this new animal. The animal, it's called a camel, it looks like this. It's got a hump. It's weird.
Barb. From the first report, I believe, showing us the Aveo, the redfish, the second.
Yeah, the second one.
The Aveo, and the numbers that you could glean from the newspaper sources.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, those exactly, going
Yes.
from prior to 1860 up to about 1930 with those peaks, indicating that maybe they're El Nino. Well, this is more, I guess, a question for scientists rather than your specialty. But you kind of wonder after 1930, maybe there are some more records somewhere on the Aveo occurrence. And then as it gets further into modern times, we're more aware of this phenomenon, El Nino, and might be able to tie that together with more assurance, which would give your gleaned information in the historical thing that much more validity, you know, tying the the old and new, I guess.
Right.
But that's more of a question, I guess, for the science folks.
Yeah, basically what we did was we researched the Hawaiian newspaper repository, so that was the main knowledge that we're.
Did you feed it to Rosie?
Yeah, so this knowledge we would feed to Dr. Rosie Allegado, and she would incorporate this into her research project.
Maybe a grad student in ichthyology.
But can I just add a note on that?
Okay.
You know, he gave 8 different things that show the El Nino sort of norms. And so looking for one of them allows us to kind of isolate the places that you go into the newspapers and look for the other kinds of norms that are present. It's El Nino. When they tell you that the last El Nino was the worst on record, I'm older than the El Nino record. So this actually opens that window another 100 years. It's not just I'll be because it's sort of the light that allows you to look for the rest of it. Otherwise, you have to manually search a whole 120 years. He provides a window that sort of narrows out the result. Didn't mean to intrude on the reason.
Oh, no.
You mentioned along there, I didn't quite get the reference.
Pu'uva'ava.
Yeah. And you referenced it to one, and when I remember that area, I didn't anything.
Kona is a notoriously dry place. Yeah, so it's fun researching water there. Pu'uva'ava to be dry, you said? Yeah, that's a lot of our research is showing like times of drought or instances where people have to go really far inland in order to get water, or in some places that was kind of just the norm. In places like Kamakahonu, they talked about how that people regularly just go inland to get water, and by the shore there's nothing. I'm not sure how dry Pu'uva'ava is, but I think ʻIkeWai is one of the only bodies of water we've kind of pulled from that area. There haven't been too much other accounts, which does tell me that it's probably a drier place. This one says, I believe in this article, it says that ʻIkeWai is about 5 fathoms deep. So it's a pretty deep pond for that time and for a dry place. Yeah, 3 feet deep, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. It's a huge repository of information there. Aren't we fortunate to have that? I'm wondering if by any chance you might, in your study of water here, run across anything documenting, coming and going, certain places on the Big Island where there's fresh water that wells up in the below the low tide zone, and I understand that Hawaiians will go out with calabashes or something and carefully invert it or whatever right over the fresh water rising up, lower density, being collected in a place where you wouldn't have surface fresh water.
Yeah, so one of the sites of interest on Kona for the hydrology team is Kiholo, and they actually have like this sniffer thing that's trying to find that phenomenon of the fresh water coming out. But we also have found accounts of people bringing their horses down to the shoreline to drink water. And yeah, well, they can't drink salt water, so if they're down by the ocean, it must mean that fresh water is coming up, or at least fresh enough that cattle and horse can drink. And then
Oh yeah, and there's also audio files that we transcribe and translate. One of them was from an elder who lived in Kapu'ulekua, the island of Hawai'i. And he talks about going down to the sea and filling up a gallon of water in the ocean during the low tide. And he actually got used to drinking water from that ocean spring. Yeah, and he even talks about going up Mauka and drinking the fresh water and actually preferring the water down at the shore.
Yeah.
Were there any articles describing the changes of the water table, the water situation, available water, with the increased growing of kiawe for cattle?
I haven't found anything specific to kiawe, but the idea of plantations or big ag coming in definitely affected the water. One of the sites is Parker Ranch. And there's actually several articles talking about when the water excavation process started over there, there was the issue of how much land had already been kind of diminished for cattle and for those types of things. And then the issue of all the Hawaiian people being kind of displaced further and further back where there was no water. So in those instances, yeah, we see like the water coming and going. For some of our EVO research, we found that Moku Ume Ume, Ford Island, was used to grow watermelons for a little bit of time, but the watermelon cultivation, I guess, took up so much water, it kind of dried it out. Dried out the availability for groundwater there. Watermelons take a lot of water to grow, so.